discussion back to the actual, away from quote-unquote speculation, talking specifically about the squibs and the actual, whether or not there were controlled demolitions present. If anyone here analyzes how controlled demolitions work, charges are placed on almost every floor of the building, and those charges go off from the ground up to maximize the gravitational forces to bring the building down in, as neatly as possible. So when looking at the footage as played for us today of World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7, you don't see any of that. You don't see any of those characteristics. Even when the screen turned blue and you took that clip from Loose Change, you were showing a squib here on this floor, a squib 20 floors down, a squib, quote unquote. How can you argue that those are squibs of controlled demolitions when that doesn't fit the bill of what a controlled demolition is? And furthermore, the only evidence that you cite to explain that bangs and the flashes was testimony. Spoken word people on the streets. That's not evidence.
Well, let me just say that I did try to make the case that this was what I call a super destruction or super controlled demolition. It was not, particularly the towers, was not like any kind of conventional one. So the argument that this was not like a conventional controlled demolition to me, is not a very strong argument. Obviously, it was quite different, and it probably was to make an effect. We don't really know what the rationale was for the design of the demolition that occurred, but I'm sure a lot of considerations were taken into account on the placement of explosives next to the core columns. I'll just say that when I look at a squib, I know enough about what had to have happened to take out the core columns. The core columns had to be removed, and exploding a core column basically blows all that core column debris out, and I would find it very difficult to get an explanation that was different than the squibs are core column materials being blown out from that floor. You do have different situations on some of the floors. You have these mechanical floors that are every so often. So there could be a rationale that says we want to do certain things on mechanical floors having to do with getting rid of the core columns that would, show up as a squib. But
the simple fact that the cores were not left standing there. It makes no sense that the entire building would be ripped apart like that. You can take away so much of what we said. You can take away the squibs, you can take away the specific chemicals we found, you can take away all kinds of stuff, and you still have way more than enough evidence to have a serious investigation, and people, instead of doing that, resisted it for 441 days. They underfunded it, they packed it with people that are close to them, that they worked with before, in positions of power. That doesn't look like the actions of the government or a group of private people or any group of people that wants to get to the bottom of what happened. And it doesn't look like any accidental or overwhelming failure from random damage. The tops of the buildings should have fallen over. You have to engineer something to go through the path of greatest resistance. So we put the squibs in there because we see them, that's what we think they are. But we could be totally wrong about that, and it wouldn't mean anything about the rest of what we're saying. David Griffin describes our argument as a cumulative argument, where it's like a cable composed of numerous strong strands. You can cut most of those strands and it will still hold up what you're trying to hold up. This is not a deductive argument where one step you get wrong gets you the wrong answer. We got that
question. I hear that you were saying controlled demolition. I hear this a lot, that controlled demolition must be started from the ground and it must go bottom top. Was that one of the questions that was in?
Well, I was saying it's generally that's how they're set up. I'm not going to say absolutely.
And in most classic controlled demolitions, they start from the bottom, but it's possible to start a demolition from at any point in the building. You can start halfway, you can start top down, you can start at bottom up. So there are lots of different ways to do controlled demolition. I heard one guy say we can make the building walk if we want to. So there's a lot of, if you understand I'm sure controlled demolitions experts they can do whatever they want.
I know apparently this is a diversion, according to the video, but what part do the planes play in this? Because it would seem to me that if there are explosives placed in the building, how do they survive the plane crash? Because that didn't go off simultaneously. The plane crashed into the building, and then minutes later, the explosions, quote unquote, happened. If they were explosions, they happened later. So how did they survive the plane crash? And on top of that, what part do the planes play in this process?
What part the planes play is it provided a cover story. Pure and simple. That was what that was. Now, your question about why didn't the explosives go off because the airplanes struck the building?
Yeah, it would seem to me that when the airplane struck the building and crashed into the building, it would have set the explosives off.
There are many explosives that are not set off by impact or even temperature. That you can make them any way you want them to stand up to things and be set off by what's called an electric match, like a 4th of July sparkler that's embedded in the material, so it doesn't go off until you have an electric charge to set that sparkler off. Also considered a black box material in the recorders in planes. Those things can tolerate high temperatures for many hours, 3,400 Gs, and still play back the recording. So you could make extremely robust, small boxes that could have withstood that, and they might have expended the expense to do that only on the impact floors, and not had to shield anything on other floors. But again, there's people I'd like to ask that question who know the answer rather than us guessing at it. But it's a good question.
There's also I'll just throw this out there, there's a military term called psychological operation, or PSYOP. And the planes, to me, fit the profile of a psychological operation, this idea of theater, of attracting people's attention to something while you go and do something else. So that's kind of my answer.
I watched the final NIST report video on the NIST website. In Building 7, they show columns falling over from a fire-induced progressive collapse. These columns are falling over inside World Trade Center 7, gradually, kind of dominoes. And then they assume that there was this shell without much support underneath that falls. Could that result in a free fall speed fall collapse?
Well, I guess you'd have to explain how the shell can remain and the innards collapse as their model apparently. I mean, I don't understand this because the shell is part of the structure. It's not built as a shell to surround the building. So the whole idea that the shell remained while the inside somehow either came down and then it came down, it's nonsensical.
Yeah, try to imagine having an erector set where you built a model of this interlaced structure, right? And you've got all the columns throughout the middle of the building. It wasn't a tube within a tube like the Twin Towers. It was a typical building with columns, whatever, every 20 feet. And just, make the floors disappear, make the walls disappear. You just got all this steel. Try to imagine reaching through there and grabbing the mass of the center steel and ripping it out of the building without the rest of it getting distorted at all. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, they said it was a new type of
They would have to say something like that, wouldn't they?
It's miraculous.
It was strange how they misspoke about that. They said that thermal expansion caused this progressive series of things, and that was a new phenomenon. Like, that's not a new phenomenon at all. Engineers plan for thermal expansion all the time. What's new is for it to cause what they say it caused. So, again, we can understand why they had to say something like that, given what their task seems to have been.